Hello and welcome everyone to the Elevate webinar series, which is a collaboration between AgeWell and their fellowship program Epic AT Health Research Training Platform, and also UHN Research Idea. I'm Patty Leek, the UHN Research Idea Educator, and today our talk is titled Implementing Sex and Gender Considerations into Health Research Funding Policy. What are we learning? Allison?
Thanks, Patty. Hi, my name is Allison Schneider, and I am the Education and Training Manager at AgeWell, Canada's Aging and Technology Network. We value the participation of each member of the community and endeavor to deliver an enjoyable and fulfilling experience at today's session. All participants are expected to conduct themselves with integrity, courtesy, and respect for others, and maintain the highest level of professionalism at this session. Disruptions that interfere with the event experience for other attendees are not permitted. Thank you for helping to make this a welcoming event for all. As you can see, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available for replay on the AgeWell's YouTube channel, and we'll provide links to that channel for you. Closed captioning of the event is available on the Zoom platform that we're using today. So you can see the 2 C's icon on your Zoom menu. And if you like, you can click there to enable the closed captions. If you select this, you will see a white script on a black background with the captions. But please note that these are automatically generated, so there may be some inaccuracies. So our general outline of the session today. So our presenter, Dr. Angela Kaida, plans to speak for about 45 minutes, and we will have a Q&A session to follow. So please post any questions or comments for the Q&A in the chat or in the Q&A box. You may also raise your hand to ask a question verbally during that Q&A session. We're very excited to have Dr. Angela Kaida here with us for today's webinar. Dr. Kaida is a global health epidemiologist and community-based researcher at Simon Fraser University, where she is an SFU Distinguished Professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences and the former Canada Research Chair in Global Perspectives on HIV and Sexual and Reproductive Health. She leads a global research program focused on factors and environments that increase vulnerability or protect sexual and reproductive health in the context of HIV. Dr. Kaida works closely with community leaders and decision makers to integrate research evidence into health policy and programming, attending to social and gender equity. In 2022, she was elected as a member of the Royal Society College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. As of January 2023, Dr. Kaida is the Scientific Director of the CIHR Institute of Gender and Health. Before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Patty for our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Allison. We would like to open the session by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all lands that we are on today. And while we are meeting on a virtual platform, we invite you to take a moment with us to reflect and acknowledge the importance of the lands that we call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility to improving relationships among our nations and to improving our own understanding of Indigenous lands, peoples, knowledges, and cultures. For those of us who are in Toronto, this land is the traditional territory of several Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, the Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This place is now also home to many Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island. Please take a moment to reflect on where you are and what you might do or learn. Thank you. Angela, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Allison and Patty, for that welcome and that land acknowledgement. I'm just starting to share my screen. Can you just let me know? Does it look good? Can you see
Looks
now?
great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody, or I guess good afternoon, depending where you are across Turtle Island. It's really a delight for me to be here with you today. Patty also already gave a little bit of my bio. And so really just to say that I am the scientific director for the CIHR Institute of Gender and Health. And so I'll really be speaking to you from that lens this morning or today. But I have, of course, because I'm a researcher as well, I've kind of tried to integrate some examples from my own work in HIV and how it intersects with sex and gender and just really trying to bring some like tangible or practical kind of conversation to sex and gender considerations in health research funding policy. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd ask Patty, one of the questions is, meeting a new community is I'm just really curious to know more about who you are for folks who have joined us today. And Patty, I don't know if we have this, or Patty or Allison, I don't know if we have this poll. Yes. So I'm just really curious about what your primary role is in the Elevate UHN Age Well community. And that just kind of helps me understand like who I'm speaking with, even in this virtual platform. So I can see lots of responses coming in, primarily from health researchers and trainees. Always amazing and wonderful to have trainees on these sessions. And I have tried to integrate some opportunities that are available for trainees. So stay tuned. So I think we've got really a health researcher and trainee audience today, which is great. So I will, so thanks so much, Allison, for putting this up. You can stop sharing it so I can get going, and I'll think about that as I go through my presentation today. And as Allison said, we're going to have some time at the end for questions and really an encouragement for you to continue to be in conversation with me and with CIHR Institute of Gender and Health as we learn together. So let me start by saying that I am joining you today from the unceded traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, which includes the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm also very delighted to join you and to acknowledge that that it is Black History Month. And so in this month, we celebrate Black health care professionals and researchers who are making a lasting positive impact on the health of Black communities and all communities actually in Canada. So I'm going to just close this thing here. All right, so today I want to invite you to reflect with me on 3 parts of this presentation today. So the first one is I really just want to start with some basic definitions of what is sex and what is gender and kind of why they matter. Then I'd love to share with you some of the work that CIHR and IGH have led around policies that now require all health researchers applying for funding from CIHR to consider sex and gender within their research proposals. And then I'd like to finish off with some reflections on what we've learned from this process and what's next. Like, what do we still need to do to further advance sex and gender integration into health research? Okay, so if that is hopefully what you came for, then let me start with our first learning objective here. So the first to say, and I think this is known to folks on this line, but really that there is a difference between sex and gender. These are not interchangeable terms. They mean and measure different things, even though in English and certainly in other languages, we tend to conflate the two. We use them interchangeably, but they are actually not interchangeable. And when we talk about sex, what we're really talking about are biological attributes of humans and animals. And so sex-related components might include physical features. It might include chromosomes. It includes gene expression, hormonal milieu, our anatomy. Whereas gender is really socially constructed and culturally constructed. So these are the roles, the identities, the expressions, the norms that shape our lives and then shape our health. And so the language, we're really, when we talk about gender, we're talking about girls, boys, men, women, gender diverse people, gender non-binary people, gender non-conforming people. Whereas when we're talking about sex, we're more using like biology language of males, females, intersex folks. And so I find it really helpful to think about sex and its dimensions rather than just sex, as if we're just talking about there's something about males or something about females, but really trying to unpack in research, like when we are talking about sex, what are the components of sex that make a difference to our research question? So, you can see these here, there's a lot of interrelationship between these different dimensions of sex, but I find it really constructive for me in my own work to think about what is it about sex that matters in my research. And this is really, this is really important. We are learning so much, like every other day I'm seeing studies that are really unpacking sex-related differences and mechanisms that shape our health. These are photos here of an X chromosome and a Y chromosome showing, really big differences in size and the number of genes, the number of proteins that each of these chromosomes code for. But yet, a lot of our research evidence base doesn't consider sex and sex-related dimensions in its work. So a study published, almost 10 years ago now, or 10 plus years ago now, saying that only a third of genome-wide association studies were including information about sex chromosomes. So it's yielding a really incomplete scientific evidence base by not including sex. And what else is happening? So if we don't include sex in both preclinical research, testing phases for drugs, for biologics, for medical devices, for technology, the potential benefits of these technologies or these drugs may not be equal among the sexes. And even worse, we may introduce harm. And there are a lot of examples, published examples of where that was the case, where studies did not consider sex-related dimensions in the production of the technology or the drug, put products out to market that actually did cause harm. And, these first two here were eventually pulled from market. And so if sex is complicated, let's talk about gender and its dimensions, which are also really important for health. And again, you can see here that sometimes when we talk about gender, we sort of think about it like this big monolith, like it's just gender. But actually, in the same way, gender also has multiple components to it. And it's really helpful, at least for me, I hope for you as well, to think about these different components and how they show up or how they may be relevant in research questions. And you can see here that like how this figure is described, you can see that there's overlap. These different forms of components of gender are interrelated as well. And so let me just take a bit of time to talk about each of these dimensions of gender and maybe how they relate to health research. And while I go through these, these different dimensions and really their definition, I'll invite you to think about like which one of these is relevant to the questions that you're pursuing. In what ways might they matter? Maybe they don't all matter for different questions. Maybe one is predominant. But let me just start with saying the first component of gender that we talk about is around gender identity. And this is about how an individual might self-identify, including how they express their gender, how they behave, and how they might be perceived by other people. And we talk about gender identity. This is where we might talk about cisgender people or transgender people or gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender diverse folks. And I think I'd like to know what your experiences are, but I think a lot of attention has focused recently on gender identity, but it's one component of gender, not the only component of gender. There's also gender relations. And this component really talks about how we interact and how we might be perceived or treated by other people because of their perceptions of our gender and our gender identity, right? And so I'm sure you can imagine, like there's a lot of ways that might show up in health in terms of how we're perceived by healthcare providers, what kind of expectations are on us for caregiving or for going to receive care. And then we have gender roles. This really speaks to social expectations and norms that are typically associated with a given gender. So this might be an expectation of who a school should call if a child is sick. This might be an expectation of who should be earning money and who should be, more serious in the workplace, who should be doing different types of jobs. And so these components of gender roles really show up in our health, in how we seek care, in the social determinants of health, and even in who is providing that care. So there's lots of ways that gender roles show up in health. And then another dimension of gender being institutionalized gender. And this is a consideration really about power. So how is power distributed in our society in ways that relate to our gender? Who has power over what? Where are resources more concentrated? Who has more decision-making in our society? Who more representation? Whose experiences are valued more than others? And so this is where you might get into research that looks at wage gaps or differences in educational attainment or career, glass ceilings and cliffs and the rest of it. And so to me, I really find it helpful to think about what is the element of gender that is most relevant to the question that I'm pursuing in my research. And I'll say that gender is really complex. And I think we're seeing that play out in public discourse in a lot of different ways. But I think it's important to say, we have to really move beyond gender as a binary, like men and women. Like, gender really exists on a spectrum. It can change over time. My expression of my gender, my experience of my gender is really socially and culturally constructed as I move into different spaces, into different parts of the country, parts of the world. The way that my gender matters or our gender matters changes as well. And so it's very complex. And one thing I'll just make sure that I say here, that our gender is not the same as our sexual orientation. I can have a particular gender and a sexual orientation. They're not the same. And so that conflation happens as well in a lot of discussions about gender and the way that gender shows up in health research. And to just kind of make it even more complicated, but hopefully more interesting for us as scientists, is that, of course, gender as a socially constructed experience does not exist in the absence of other intersecting factors or other parts of our identities. Right? Of course, the fact that you are a man, that you may be South Asian, that you may be from a middle upper class community, etc. All of those features of your identity and your social position intersect to shape your life and your health and your access to healthcare, etc. And so these are complicated things to consider for analyses, but I think our position is that this really makes for rich and nuanced and necessary thinking for our research and for the impact that the research that we undertake can have. And so you may have seen this terminology of SGBA+, which stands for Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Plus. And there's across the health portfolio, across several government departments, there are requirements, increasing requirements for utilizing an SGBA plus analysis approach to our work. And really what that's referring to is pursuing an analytic approach that systematically integrates sex and gender, and the plus being these other diversity dimensions throughout all the stages of research. And that might include like, what's your research question? What's the design of your research? Who are you recruiting? Who feels that they're welcome in this study? Whose experiences are being prioritized? Whose are being overlooked? How do you collect this data? Is it inclusive to the experiences of trans folks, for example? What analyses can we undertake? How do we report the results in our publications, and then how do we use that research to mobilize and mobilize knowledge that is relevant to the different communities or populations who need to know this information. And so I'll share with you a really brief example. Like I wish I had more time. I can't go into it in great detail, but just in some of the ways that sex and gender show up in some of the work that I do in HIV research. And this is just meant to be kind of illustrative, but here I'm just sharing a map of the world color-coded with those countries where the prevalence of HIV is higher among adult populations. You see the darker red color, but really to say that across the world, there's close to 40 million people living with HIV, and that over half of them are women and girls. And that is a finding that for a lot of people in the global north comes across as very surprising. We've been taught that HIV affects a particular demographic. That demographic usually looks like men, usually looks like gay men, white gay men, sort of middle class gay men, but that is not actually the picture of HIV globally. And so, the question sort of arises is that if that's the case, and it has been the case for 25 plus years, why is that? Why do we have such a high incidence and prevalence of HIV among women? And if you start to unpack this, there's really, complicated reasons to explain this, but there are really clear sex-related differences in HIV acquisition risk. We know, for instance, that the male to female transmission of HIV is about twice as high as female to male. And this is in the absence of when you don't use condoms or PrEP or other prevention strategies. And a lot of that is due to greater physiological vulnerability to HIV acquisition among females, really about anatomy, about gene expression, about hormones. And there's several, reasons here. For example, that the mucosal lining of the vagina offers a larger surface area to be exposed to HIV-infected seminal fluid. We know that, for instance, semen has a higher concentration of HIV virus than vaginal secretions, which increases risk of infection upon exposure. We know that a genital tract infection known as bacterial vaginosis is symbiotic with HIV acquisition, meaning that somebody with a female with bacterial vaginosis has a 60% increased risk of HIV transmission. But sex alone is not driving this trend that we see in HIV, the distribution of HIV. Gender also has an extremely profound role. And depending on if you're a basic scientist or population public health social scientist, you probably think about this in really different ways. But in actuality, both of these effects are happening simultaneously to compound risk. And so I've offered some examples of what we know in the ways in which gender shapes HIV risk. We know about gender-based violence. We know that gender intersects with other social determinants of health to make women and gender diverse people more likely to live in poverty, that these inequities propagate the practice of intergenerational sex, which presents high risk of HIV acquisition. So I don't want to move you into an HIV-focused lecture, but really wanted to share with you some of the ways that, really practical ways that gender and sex show up in the work that I do. And my own work has actually really moved into a space of aging, healthy aging as well. I know many of you are healthy aging or aging-related researchers. And just to say, as I've moved into this area of research, which is just so exciting and so dynamic, it's been quite incredible because people living with HIV in Canada are really the first cohort of people living with HIV who are moving into being seniors and having considerations. They're living long enough to consider, right? Oh, what might be my long-term care options or realities? How do my antiretroviral therapy drugs interact with other medications I might be taking for for comorbidities, or for cis women? What might be the questions about menopause and living with HIV that are questions that we've just never had to examine previously because we've never had this cohort of people. So there are so many fascinating questions and research opportunities in that space. But I think at this point, I want to move us into the second part of the presentation. So hopefully what I've done is help stimulate some thinking about sex and gender and its dimensions and how they might show up in your own research questions, and sort of some definitions of how to think about these dimensions. But I want to share with you um, some information. So let me just say this. So knowing that sex and gender considerations matter in research, and knowing that we have an evidence base, a health research evidence base that is very biased because it hasn't enrolled sufficient diversity of people by sex, gender, and other considerations. We need a more robust evidence base. What did CIHR, or Canadian Institutes of Health Research, do to help develop and implement policies that required sex and gender considerations in health research funding applications, and a bit of like what happened from some of those policies? Okay, so first I better make sure that everybody here knows about the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. I find that as Canadians, like, we always know about the NIH, and we know about like Tony Fauci, like massive celebrity, but we don't know that CIHR in Canada, we have our own Tony Fauci, and her name is Charu Kaushik, and she leads the CIHR Institute of Infection and Immunity. But really that CIHR is how our federal health research funding agency, like here in Canada. And it's a pretty unique model in the sense that it's composed of 13 virtual institutes, in the sense that the institutes they move depending on where the scientific director is located. So the Institute of Gender and Health, which you can see over here, used to be in Montreal under the leadership of Dr. Kara Tenenbaum, and then has just moved to Vancouver at Simon Fraser University as I became the scientific director. But together, these 13 institutes that really have quite wide-ranging and quite different mandates come together with an executive management team to form what's called Science Council, and to help deliver on the strategic plan of CIHR to improve the health of Canadians. And so our institute, so the Institute of Gender and Health, we have a mission to support research excellence regarding the influence of sex and gender on health, but also to apply these findings to identify and address pressing health challenges facing men, women, girls, boys, and gender diverse people. We have quite a unique mandate in a lot of ways, because we cut across all 4 pillars of health research. And as well, like, sex and gender considerations are relevant no matter what type of research that you're doing. So we have this really cross-cutting mandate across the health research portfolio. And last year we released an impact report of what it is our institute has done and what we're learning over time. And so I think a link might be coming into your chat in a moment, but anything that I present here today that you want the link on, just please follow up with me. I'm super happy to provide those directly. But I think what I want to share is that I think at IGH, we really think of ourselves as more than a funder, and we're really influencing sex and gender integration. If we relied on a very small group of Canadian researchers to be the ones who did sex and gender integration, we just could never have the impact necessary. And so what's been done is that IGH, in collaboration with CIHR, has required Canadian research to explain how sex and gender will be factored into their studies in all CIHR funding applications. So if you're a health researcher, which most of you are, or a trainee, you will have seen this section on your project grant application. Right? Are sex considerations taken into account? Are gender considerations taken into account? If yes or no, please just explain why that is. Okay, so this is a policy that was first initiated in 2011. And over that time, what you can see in the slides, in this slide, is that from 2011 to 2022, this policy has had a remarkable impact, in the sense that Up to now, about 90% of all proposals submitted to CIHR do describe how sex considerations are relevant or taken into account into their proposals. And now 40% of proposals do consider how gender is taken up. And this looks like kind of bad, right? Like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Like, why only 40% of applications consider gender? And that's because not all health research has a gender consideration. So if you're working with cell cultures or you're working with molecules, like the role of gender is not present in your research. And so that's fine. Like if it's not relevant at all, then it's not relevant. But if you are working with humans, then it is relevant. And so that's the research that we're trying to improve in terms of uptake of sex and gender considerations. And so these are, this is a proportion, this is a percentage, and we can talk about, what it means, and I'll get into that a little bit further. But one component of it that I do think is really important is that what it means is the dollars that we are spending on health research in this country are now more inclusive. They are relevant to a broader group of people by sex and gender considerations. So if it was only 58 million in 2011, with this policy, it's now 900 billion. Like, we really are moving towards a goal to make the science that we fund more rigorous, to make the policies that emerge from this evidence base more inclusive, to really try to achieve this goal of maximizing research impact, as well as opening the door to new scientific discovery. And, I'm really proud to say this because really I had nothing to do with this ranking, but that, a recent review in Science that looked at funding agencies in countries around the world ranked CIHR #1 for appropriately considering sex, gender, and intersectionality in funding policy, and really making a call for all funding agencies to move in this direction. So I'll just spend a few minutes trying to share with you why we did this and how we did it and like where we got to. And so, of course, when you want to create any type of change, you have to have a plan. And this Cotter, if you've read this book by John Cotter, Iceberg is Melting, outlining these 8 steps for leading organizational changes, thinking about how do you create a sense of urgency? How do you build a coalition? How do you develop a change vision and strategy, communicate that vision to others, empower others and remove barriers, produce some of these short-term wins, don't let up, and then to work towards creating a new culture and understanding that this type of change is iterative. It doesn't move linearly through these steps, but these steps helped really understand what it is we could do. And this starts with the fact that we had a policy in 2009. Canada's health portfolio had an SGBA policy that all programs should be using the sex and gender-based analysis policy to to develop, implement, and evaluate research programs policies. And so we had a policy in place to build from, but we didn't know who was implementing it. Was there any accountability for that policy? And so that led CIHR to add this question, the sex and gender question, to all CIHR application forms, which I showed you earlier. And so we started to measure what happened. Once we did put that policy in place, did we see a change? You can see here, this is 2011 to 2013. Okay, pretty good. The proportion of applications saying that their work had relevance to sex or relevance to gender did increase a little bit, but still at the end of the day, over half of applications weren't considering sex, and 3/4 weren't considering gender. So pretty clear that if you want to make change, you've got to do better than that. So what do you do? How do you move this bar forward? And again, our work was really underscored by 3 principles. The first one was about improving motivation. So all of us as researchers and as people, we really just hate checkbox exercises, right? Like, we hate that. And so if the idea of doing a sex and gender consideration just felt like a checkbox exercise, some administrative piece of work that we had to do, pretty uninspiring. And so there was a number of different strategies here to say, okay, we're going to make this policy. Everybody has to do it, but we have to talk about the purpose of it. What are we trying to do with implementing a policy on sex and gender? So this was really talking about rigor in science, in reproducibility of scientific findings, putting forward a principle of doing no harm. This was not about a punitive exercise of like, if you don't do it, this was really about, there's an opportunity here for inclusion, for discovery, and for more nuanced science. With that motivation, it's clear that you have to support people's capability. People want to do sex and gender considerations, and they need help to understand how to do that better. And so training and coaching supports. And then, of course, some opportunity here where even if all of us as researchers are doing a great job of putting sex and gender considerations into our applications, but peer reviewers don't know how to review these applications. They don't know what's a strength, what's not a strength. Like, we're being kind of punished for integrating sex and gender considerations. So nobody wants that outcome. And so ensuring that we also worked at that end, that there's some accountability from peer reviewers, that they were evaluating the sex and gender considerations, not just as a quantity, like, yeah, they did it or no, they didn't, but as a quality of integration. And so here, if you are a peer reviewer for CIHR, you will be familiar with this part of your review form where you're asked about, please indicate your appraisal of integration of sex as a strength, weakness, or not applicable, and your appraisal of gender. And then to explain why you've reached that conclusion. And so this form I'm sure those of you who've received reviews from peer reviewers, you'll have your own stories about fantastic peer review comments on this, really strange ones, really, problematic ones. And this is all part of the effort to improve our collective capacity to do sex and gender considerations. And so we started to see some success, right? Where an increasing proportion of proposals were accounting for sex. Peer review comments and assessments were helping to improve that proportion and that trend. And so in 2015, we were like, okay, we better be providing these online training modules to help people understand sex and gender in their research, and some guidance on how they can include sex and gender considerations in data collection and analysis throughout their research proposals. So I'm sure many of you have had to complete these training certificates at some point in your CIHR application life. But that was really the genesis of why these modules were created. It was to support the research community to be able to answer those questions on sex and gender considerations. And of course, we provide at IGH a bunch of additional kind of what we kind of call coaching materials. So if you have specific questions around how do I try to think about what might be driving sex-related differences that I'm seeing, what types of analytic approaches are available to me when I might have a smaller sample size, how do I measure hormones in my samples if I am including male and female mice. And so we've tried to be responsive to some of the questions that we received to provide some best practice guidance from experts across the country. And some of this guidance has come in the form of what we've called the Meet the Methods series. So over time, I hope it's fair to say, and you'll correct me if this is like my own bias, I suppose. But as I've been across the country, I've really been hearing an interest and a willingness and a desire to consider sex and gender in our research, but really a request for methods, methodological advancement, methodological guidance, where many of us are kind of dealing with some of the similar questions. And so we have reached out to researchers across the country that are doing really innovative methodological work in this space and have tried to provide these shorter, kind of more concise Meet the Methods documents that give an introduction to the ways in which some methodological innovation can be applied into your research, with, of course, additional support for further reading. So I've just displayed 2 here. I think we probably have about close to 20 available on the website that address different questions. And I will just put an offer that if there are questions and methods that you're interested in that you don't see an answer to on the Meet the Methods, is to reach out to us, and we can start to work with the right people to develop another Meet the Methods, another component of Meet the Methods. And so what happened? So what is happening? So I showed you at the beginning that as this policy and as these supports went into place, that we really are seeing an increasing proportion of applications that consider sex and gender. But okay, that's pretty good. But what else is happening? And what we're learning is that when peer reviewers assess that the sex and gender considerations of a proposal are considered a strength of that proposal, that the odds of being funded are now higher. So, which is important, because actually if we were doing great sex and gender consideration, but it wasn't impacting the odds of funding success, that's a concern. But actually what we see here is that the odds of being funded are now higher. So it is mattering to peer reviewers, and it's mattering to the quality of the assessment of the quality of the research that's being proposed. But what else is what else is happening in practical terms? And so one of the things that we've been able to do with various researchers and clinicians across the country is to say that as we've built up an evidence base that does a better job of considering sex and gender, that we've been able to influence clinical practice guidelines that then similarly consider sex and gender in their clinical practice guidelines. So here's one example from the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, which is committed to issuing separate recommendations for the cardiovascular health by sex, because there's now a strong enough and a rigorous enough evidence base to do so. And then, of course, a lot of this is about discovery. What is it that we've taken for granted in our understanding by not taking sex and gender into consideration? And what is it that we can now discover and learn more about? And so there's a few different really incredible examples of scientific breakthroughs. And I've shared 2 here around female E. coli antibodies and sex differences and the mechanisms of chronic pain that really were the pathway through which was an examination of sex-related mechanisms in both. And so it's really to say that I hope I have convinced you at least a little bit that this exercise of considering sex and gender is not a checkbox exercise. This is really about the robustness, the inclusion, the opportunity available to our science. So in my final, few minutes here, what I would like to do is just turn some attention towards, like, if this is what we've learned from implementing this policy, what is it that we kind of need to do further to advance sex and gender considerations and integration into health research? And part of this reflection in my next section, I'm sharing with you in 2 ways. The first one is that our institute spent several months last year on a national listening tour. And this was really about trying to get a sense from our community of, like, where are we at? Like, where is the excitement? Where are there gaps? Where are things getting even more confusing and muddled? And what is the role that we can play at IGH to support our research community? And there's a few, there's actually a lot here. I will show that there has been doing this. I always joke that I'm like Taylor Swift, like I did an Eras tour last year across the country. But I think what was really exciting is the level of, like, excitement around sex and gender in research, sex and gender science, the potential on offer, the engagement of communities who are affected by sex and gender related inequities to be a part of this conversation and to be part of this work. But there are some pretty clear like demands. And one of them is, which I've called here like a sex and gender integration hotline. And this is something that we're working on at IGH around when you have questions of like, I'm trying to think through what might be the analytic approach to do a better job of considering gender in my study on, technology to support aging in place. Like this is something that perhaps our institute can help, or if we can't help you, we can kind of help connect you with people that have done a lot of thinking in this space, and just to sort of help us all increase our collective capacity. Another response that we really have heard loud and clear is about expanding the Meet the Method series, particularly in areas where folks are working with what they might call like small sample sizes. What are the analytic techniques available to me to do statistical analyses that don't just control for gender, but consider gender or sex as a discovery variable? Integrating, working really closely with the sex and gender science champions, committing to ongoing peer reviewer training. And as well, for those of you who are trainees, we have created an IGH sex and gender science training network across the country with, I think, 23 chapters at universities from coast to coast to coast. And really, this is about supporting trainees to come together with a little bit of funding, with some connection to a larger network, to help learn more about sex and gender science and the practice of integrating sex and gender. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'll be happy to share more as part of the Q&A or afterwards. And I think the other thing that's really come to our attention, and if you have completed one of the online training modules recently, I know that you will agree with me that we do need to update the online training modules. They were created in 2015. And what is remarkable is the amount that we have learned about sex and gender in the 9 years. Is that good math? 5. Yeah, in the 9 years since is remarkable. And these training modules need to reflect the changes in language, the changes in the science, the changes in how we've understood what we understand about sex and gender science. And I think what we've also seen is that who belongs to our research community has expanded. We now have, many of us have community partners and knowledge users and Indigenous leaders, Indigenous elders, people with lived and living experience as part of our research. And the training modules need to reflect what their training and capacity bridging needs are as well. And so that's an effort that we are undertaking at IGH this year in support of our collective learning as a health research community. I've had a lot of requests and some real confusion around language, and I really empathize with this. The language of sex and gender is really changing. It's dynamic. This is just speaking in English, let alone French or other languages. And so I think some guidance around what language do we use when we're talking about sex? What language do we use when we talk about gender? What's an identity? What's a process? There's some guidance I think the collective community could really benefit from at this stage of our kind of collective development. And then to say that just, that we really have to think deeply about what are some other indicators of sex and gender integration and impact across the research life cycle. And here I think about, yes, we have seen an increase in the proportion of grant applications that consider sex and gender, but like, does that translate for all of us into, yeah, I actually do this in my research. I actually collect data in this way. I analyze the data in this way. I publish the data with sex and gender considerations, etc. I mean, I'm going to suspect that we drop off pretty quickly from grant application commitments to, published papers. And so really to have deeper impact and learning in this space, we're going to have to take a look at how the integration shows up at different stages in the research life cycle. And this is really important. This, again, is not just a checkbox exercise. This is an infographic from a paper published by Rebecca Recklin in Nature Communications Rebecca's a member of Lisa Galia's lab. And what they looked at was they analyzed neuroscience and psychiatry papers that were published over a 10-year period to examine what had changed in terms of discovery, opportunity for discovery of sex differences. And honestly, I found this paper to be really fascinating because in the one sense they did show, if I can draw your attention to this line here, I hope you can see I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the second line here, that in the one hand, they did see that there was quite an increase in the proportion of studies that enrolled both sexes or had both animals from both sexes in the research, which is fantastic, right? That's a metric that we want to see. But actually, when you started to look at whether these studies had an optimal design for discovery of possible sex differences, you see how quickly that cuts down, both whether we're looking at 2009 or 2019. And the proportion that had an optimal analytic approach for discovery, you can see is even smaller. And so really the work ahead of us is in this space of design and analysis and interpretation and knowledge mobilization. So I feel like we've done step 1 and 2 pretty well, but how do we get to a space where we can actually design studies to examine these sex and gender differences and mechanisms and to see what matters? And so almost at the end here is to say, I think we've got a real opportunity to think about going beyond just describing differences. A lot of health research will say, this is men, this is women, this is what happens for men, but without really kind of unpacking what the mechanisms of those differences are. And I think that's a very exciting area of research for us as Canadian health researchers, because when we focus on these factors and processes, it's going to help us understand why we see differences, what the causal pathways might be, whether those are meaningful at all or not, and actually like what to do about them, right? This is where we want to move, which is into an impact space. And so to do that, we have to learn from the best. And we have incredible researchers across the country who are leading the charge in these understandings of mechanisms and processes. And we're going to bring them together in the IGH Summer Institute. So the first one is going to be here in Vancouver, June 9th to 14th. Those of you who are trainees, I'll let you know that we do have a trainee travel award to attend the Summer Institute. Those are due March 1st, so really quick, but still time to apply. And there's a link here. I hope somebody can put the link actually into the chat. And then in future years, we are offering an operating grant to other institutions to host the Summer Institute to help advance our learning in sex and gender science. And I'll end here by just saying that I think what we have to also be mindful of is that the social and political context of sex and gender have really shifted over time. Conversations about sex and gender are happening like in every sphere of our lives. Our kids are talking about it. Our parents are talking about it. And a lot of harmful policy actually is being driven from conversations where the contribution of scientists are insufficiently considered in these policy discussions. And I really see that for us as health researchers, we have a profoundly important role to play. And really to say that we need a robust scientific evidence base to inform how sex and gender impact our health, and to inform public understanding, public discourse, and public policy around sex and gender as well. So I will leave you with these calls to action in your own work, in your own learning, in your own goals for equity, etc., around the ways that sex and gender can show up in your research, and how we can collectively learn and do better. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much for listening to me and being a part of this conversation, and really open to your comments, your questions, and an opportunity, I guess, an invitation to stay in relation.
Thank you so much, Angela. A lot of amazing resources there for trainees. Thanks so much for sharing. We will follow up with folks with all these links. If you've registered for this session, you'll receive an email with the links. So always lots of resources to look at and study up on post-webinar. I'm just going to post your contact information here too for folks for CIHR.
Yes.
I know you have, you have the slide there as well, but just in case people want to jot those down, but I'll include those as well in our email to all registrants. We don't have a lot of time for questions, so I'll jump to one that was sent right away. Okay, so many researchers publish the results stating sex difference in pain and say women have more pain than men. Does it matter what language or term is used? For example, males versus men. So this is specific in the chat if you want to.
Yeah. So I'll just kind of scroll. I like this question so much. I just want to make sure that there we go. Okay, does it matter what language term is used, males versus men? So I guess the question here, thank you, Binu, for asking this question. So I'll start in general to say that, of course, the language that we use in surveys, for example, to query people about their pain, how severe their pain is gendered. We interpret those questions differently. So part of that could be explained by gendered language. But I think your question is asking, like, is it if the research is talking about males have this proportion of chronic pain versus men have this proportion of chronic pain? And this is such a great question because it depends on what do you think might be driving those differences? If that research is coming from mice, then the use of the word males is reasonable because we're talking about sex-related differences in animals. But if we're talking about people, then really thinking about what is driving this, what is my mechanism that I'm thinking about? Is it a sex-related mechanism, or is it a gender-related mechanism, or is it the interaction of the two, which is something I didn't talk too much about, but is also at play. And so I think what we advise a research team is to use really precise language. Are you doing this research in mice, in which case talking about sex-related differences is probably the right language to use? Are you doing this research in humans that has self-report, in which case gender and sex are both probably having a bearing on reports of chronic pain. So Binu, I hope that answers that, touches on your question or your interest in that question.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we'll get one more in. This person says, I work in the community-based dementia intervention space, and anonymity seems to be quite important. We have a hard time getting people to disclose identity characteristics, along with self-identifying as a person living with dementia. I would be interested in learning more about strategies or insights to overcome stigma-related barriers to collecting data that relate to people's identities. Is this on the topic list for supports, or do you have any insights that you're able to share with us now?
Oh, Nathan, what a great question. So what I can say, I don't have like a meet the methods or something that I can say, yeah, just send this your way and you can use that resource. But I can share that there is a large group called the Women, Sex and Gender and Dementia Consortium that is part of a Canadian network of researchers and people with lived experience doing work in neurodegenerative disease and aging. And so one of the things that I can do is quite readily connect you with their team. They're at U of T. Julian Einstein is their PI, and they have been grappling with this question. So I would prefer to put you in touch so that the question, you get the right answer, but it is a huge topic of conversation among that group.
Thank you so much. So I think I'm going to wrap up now, just in the interest of time. We do want to thank you so much for your presentation today, Angela. Really important conversation and really good to lay out clearly exactly what the expectations and thinking are behind CIHR's policies, and hoping that people will embrace those modules, learn more about, you know, sex and gender, and how it can be used in their research to actually provide more evidence-based research that applies to the real world. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, and thank you so much to the AgeWell team for inviting me here today. Please do reach out if you've got any questions that we couldn't get to today.
Yes, definitely. And I'll send everyone the contact information so you'll be able to communicate directly with that team at CIHR. So thanks so much, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so
Take care.
much. Bye, Angela.
Bye.